My name is George Galloway, presenter of كلمة on Mayadeen television. Morning to you. I don't mince my words. I speak كلمة and my audience does too. كلمة free word, free for me, free for you. Catch it. Nice to meet you, brother. Welcome to كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television. Coming to you from London, but talking about France and France's global reach. Little Macron is back. He will not be a particularly significant figure in French history, in my view, but I may be being cruel. I don't like him. Let me confess that right at the beginning. But he does have a knack of coming up on top. He managed to, in the first term, elbow the centre-right out of the limelight in French politics and become the standard bearer for what you might call a kind of Tony Blair centrism. And he's just been re-elected. It wasn't an overwhelming vote of confidence. 57% of the electorate who did turn out, more of those who didn't later, chose him over, well, Marine Le Pen, a candidate bitterly controversial, regarded by many in France, despite her efforts to cover her tracks, or the tracks, perhaps more particularly of her father, of being far right, even neo-fascist. After all, her father was a collaborator in the Vichy regime that collaborated in running France during the Second World War in alliance with Adolf Hitler. And he still only got 57% in an election against someone with that controversial a past. It could so easily have been different. Jean-Luc Mélenchon, my candidate, let me put my cards on the table, was only a couple of percent away from being in the final ballot against President Macron. If the odds and sods of the Trotskyite and Maoist and other ultra-left groups had not stood but backed Mélenchon, then Mélenchon would be in the Élysée Palace today. Of that, I am perfectly sure. On the other hand, Marine Le Pen's efforts to cover her tracks were partially successful. She managed to attract people who would regard themselves as more respectable conservatives to her side, her banner, in a way that she had not been able to do so before. But in the end, the choice between Macron and the far right, as it was universally more or less in the media portrayed, saw Macron home. But here's the rub. There's a third round of voting. In the French parliamentary elections next month in June, it's quite likely that either Le Pen's group or Mélenchon's group, I think probably the latter, is going to emerge as the new government of France. Mélenchon might be the next prime minister. That will lead to a period of very uneasy cohabitation between the government of France and the president of France. What are the big issues that will divide them? Well, for a start, most French people are not that keen on NATO. In fact, it used to be the default position of the French right, the Gaullists, that they did not want to be led into wars by the United States of America. The French right in the 1960s and early 70s actually withdrew from the political leadership of NATO. They remained in the military alliance, but they would not accept political direction from what they saw, quite rightly, as its Anglo-Saxon leadership. So that's number one. Number two is Frexit, or the European Union. Macron is Mr. European Union. A very substantial proportion of the French people is not much in love with Brussels, with the Brussels bureaucracy, and with the, frankly, globalist pretensions of the European Union's leadership. Both Mélenchon and Le Pen are very much less in love with the European Union than Macron is himself. Then there are issues like the raising of the retirement age. Macron is responsible for that. The package of neoliberal proposals, laws, changes that he has made during his first term have proved deeply unpopular with huge swathes of the French population. The Yellow Vest movement, which didn't get much coverage abroad, only on RT, and that's one of the reasons they closed RT down, is not that widely known in the West, and neither is Macron's response to it, which was one of extreme brutality, which, if it had taken place in Moscow, would have been the number one item on the news. One last point from me before I introduce my distinguished panel of experts, I'm just the enthusiastic amateur, is the issue of race and immigration. Here we had, if you like, the ultimate dilemma for people of color, for Muslim people, for people of immigrant background. Who to support? Macron, who goes around the world killing people that look like me, or Marine Le Pen, who doesn't like the way we dress and would be meaner, perhaps more honest about her attitude to the millions, 7, 8, 9 million Muslims in France alone, and many millions more non-Muslim people of color in the country. That was a serious dilemma for people. I don't know how they resolved it. I haven't been able to focus as closely on the French election as I would have liked. Well, there's a war on, if you know what I mean. But we do have experts here who do know what they are talking about in that regard. Let me go first to Amina Kərmous, who's a consultant and life coach, but perhaps most pertinently for this debate, is an activist from Lyon in France, but who's had to leave France for the United Kingdom because she wasn't able to live a normal life and wear her hijab in France. Amina, welcome back to the show. Let's start where I finished, if we may. I don't want to ask you how you personally voted. That's regarded as impolite, at least in England. But people like you, who could they choose in a final ballot between Macron and Le Pen?
Yes, hi. I saw a lot of different opinions in many different groups. A lot of people said, like you said, Marine Le Pen is, we know, a racist, but at least it's clear. So we know what to expect. And the other one, we pretend to be our friend in some way, but then we'll put his bombs once he's... So there were a lot of debate. Some people said, oh, we have to choose between plague and cholera, as we say in French. And some people said, yes, that's true, we have to choose, and actually plague is more...
And what did they choose, plague or cholera?
Generally, they choose the cholera because there is a more survival rate than plague.
That's very well put.
That's basically what they said. We prefer having cholera than plague because obviously the results are more damageable. But yes, there was that debate, and there was a little another debate of should we vote? Is it forbidden? Is it haram? Is it halal to vote? And there was all this debate going around as well. And finally, I think most of people actually said we have to go not for the better, but for the least worse, as we say.
And that was Macron.
Yeah. Yeah, most people did that, actually. But they are saying now, let's go for the third turn now. and they want to really change everything for the legislative.
Do you agree with me that Mélenchon stands a fighting chance of being the Prime Minister?
Yes, yes. And actually, a lot of people were calling to vote for him before I was talking only about Marine Le Pen.
Round,
yeah. But at the first, a lot of people saying, yes, Mélenchon is quite the best. I know we don't agree with everything with him, but that would be the best or the least damageable for us as a community in France. So yes, and now they want to go for maybe that for the legislative. And for the legislative, there is a Muslim party as well. There is a Muslim political party. I don't know how powerful, how successful it is and it will be. But I think a lot of people now will be more active voting than before.
Yes, because Dr. Nile Mcrae, welcome back. Nile is an officer of the Workers of England trade union. He's part of the pro-Brexit Bruges group and participated in the UK Yellow Vests movement. Maybe we'll get on to talk about the UK and what happens next here later in the show. At least I hope so, because everything that happens in France impacts Britain, because the European Union is very much a Franco-German partnership now. But staying with France for the moment, turnout was down, considerably down, so many people decided not to vote for cholera or for plague. Can you understand their point of view?
Well, yes, I can. And I think that more recently, perhaps the most discriminated against group in France has been the unvaccinated, who were barred from going into shops, basic services they weren't allowed to attend. And it's interesting what you said about how it was the French government that played quite a big role in getting RT deplatformed, because RT was one of the few media that were covering the very large protests against Macron's COVID regime, which is one of the strictest in the world. And
to no great effect either.
Yeah,
it's not
indeed.
as if France escaped the pandemic.
Indeed, it was a plague pit. Sorry to use your term again. Les Gilets jaunes were very key, very prominent in protesting against Macron's COVID regime, which was really quite a tyranny. And they've had their anthem since 2018, which I'll translate in a moment, but just for authenticity, it's "On est là, même si Macron ne le veut pas, nous on est là, pour l'honneur des travailleurs et pour un monde meilleur, même si Macron ne le veut pas, nous on est là." The workers are here. We are here. We are not going away. Macron doesn't like us, but we will keep coming back. And they keep turning out in cities, not just Paris, all across France, protesting. And it must be very disillusioning for them, disappointing for them that here we have Macron again. But actually, I think this is going to be a miserable term, second term for Macron. I think that he's widely despised. I mean, some of you may have seen the clip of him going to a football stadium the other day, and he was so loudly booed. And I just think that he is not popular. If you were one of those unvaccinated people, of which I think it was, 20% of the population of France wasn't vaccinated, you were stopped from going about your ordinary life because you didn't want to take these injections. And they wouldn't have voted for Macron. He's built up and he's building up more and more groups, more and more segments of French society that despise him.
Indeed, Joseph Robertson was a star of a previous show. I'm very glad to see you back, Joseph. Strategic Director of the Orthodox Conservatives Group, which does what it says on the tin. It's conservative, but not as you know it. It's proper Orthodox conservatism, which isn't quite the same as right-wing, as you'll discover. Joseph, who did then vote for Macron? If the unvaccinated didn't vote for him, if the people who supported the yellow vests didn't vote for him, if the immigrant population was only lukewarm about voting for him, if the elderly who are now going to have to work longer for their pension, makes you wonder where he got 57%.
I think the thing with Macron is that he's a safe bet, right? So he's the worst choice if you want to focus on policy, and the best choice if you want to focus on keeping things the same. And I think this was a similar problem we had in the 2019 election, where no one really knew what Boris was going to do in terms of policy, but they knew that he was pro-Brexit. We wanted a pro-Brexit candidate, so we got Boris. I think it's a similar thing with Macron. They know that he'll keep things the same. So your middle of the road, sort of, middle class, if we can call it that, in France, are going to vote Macron when they don't have Mélenchon and they don't have Zemmour and they don't have Le Pen, because they know those candidates won't win. And if they do get in, they don't know exactly what will happen with the international community. There's another thing that I pointed out more recently, which was on what Macron's been doing with digital currency, which I think has really brought some of the business leaders in France back to him. And he's been very careful to keep France ahead of the curve in terms of developing their own digital currency. We know China are trying to pull a lot of the rest of the global community into their own version of crypto, which they're setting up based on their WeChat platform. Russia's bought in, Australia's bought in, India's buying in to this new digital currency. France are trying to provide an alternative to that, and I think the business community in France quite like that. So they probably lobbied to help him out in that sense. They're seeing somebody who will present their interests at the globalist table, and much as we may not like that side of the table, obviously people are interested in staying part of that global community. So I think that's what happened.
He does try. Let me try and be fair to Macron. He is a globalist, but not as much as the rest. He is pro-American, but not as much as the rest.
Yeah.
He is extremely hostile to Russia, but not as hostile as the rest.
Yes, yeah.
I didn't want him to win, but I'd rather have Macron than little soldier Schulz or Boris Johnson, or even worse, Keir Starmer in Britain. I mean, he does have some saving graces, is what I'm saying.
I think someone like Schulz is an interesting choice, because I personally think he's now Macron's sock puppet, essentially. And I think what we've seen is a massive shift in German foreign policy, especially regarding Russia, as you know. Since Macron's regained his stability and leadership, suddenly Germany are using the same rhetoric that we were using at the start of the Ukraine conflict. So I think there's a very key consolidation for France in terms of the EU as becoming the leader, not just in terms of the EU itself, but Macron becoming, if you like, the Boris figure of Europe. Boris sort of more leading the Anglo-US relationships now, Macron maybe leading Europe. So I think, love him or hate him, I hate him, but I think he's there to stay in that sense. I think he's consolidated his power quite well, actually. And most of his issues now are going to be internal rather than on the global stage.
He's certainly no fool. Let's hear from Hamid Kriet in Paris, France. He's a French-Moroccan political commentator and columnist, very regular now on French television and radio and in the newspapers. Very good of you to join us, Hamid.
Thank you, George.
Has this been a clean, easy victory for Macron?
Well, I believe it was a tremendous victory for the election, the French presidential election. Macron has been elected for the second time. But I think the most important thing is the abstention. The rate of the abstention was higher than before, in 2017, when Emmanuel Macron was the new president. And I believe now there's a fracture in the French society. We've seen there's a lot of abstentionism, as I mentioned previously, and the fracture is increasing considerably in France. Now Macron has to, of course, unify a new government or to organize a new government for the third round. So we'll have a lot of controversy against him. We have, I believe we have three blocks today. We have the first block, which is the centrists, which is represented by Emmanuel Macron. We have the second round, which is the far right with Marine Le Pen, and the third with the left, the far left, which Jean-Luc Mélenchon. And as he mentioned, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, they will have now a third round. Jean-Luc Mélenchon maybe will win the legislative or the parliamentary election, and it can be a prime minister in France, and we can have, of course, a cohabitation with Emmanuel Macron, and this will destabilize the Macron policies. Emmanuel Macron today is unpopular. Unfortunately, people did not vote. That's why facilitate the election for the Emmanuel Macron.
You just said that Macron's not popular, but he won the election. How can you claim he's not popular?
Well, when he won the election, we had, of course, the yellow vest that they went to the street, protesting against him. People did not believe in the democracy. So behind Emmanuel Macron or other candidates, there is a democratic crisis in France. People do not believe in democracy. And I think this is the major factors in France. That's why today we have a huge crisis, democratic crisis in the parliament. People think that it doesn't matter to go and to vote because the vote will not change their life. So people are desperate, in politics. They don't believe, they are not interested in politics, and this is, I think, will of course increase the democratic crisis in France. The major factor and challenge for the President Macron is, first of all, to stabilize the political situation and the French institution. We are in the Fifth Republic, French Republic, and this Fifth Republic is finished now. I believe that the regime of France now is not, adequate for the institution, for the French institution. So people want more democracy. They want a referendum. They want to have a local referendum, a regional referendum, national referendum to decide for themselves, in order to decide for themselves, to have a power, a local power, and to, of course, be engaged in the national policies.
We saw protests in the street within hours, basically, of Macron's re-election. How important are these protests, and are we likely to see much more of that?
Protests are very, huge and important because of the impact of the population. People, they have a anger. We've seen the anger in the street. People are fed up because of the raise of the life, the cost of the life, due to the Russian invasion in Ukraine. We've seen how the gas, the oil has increased considerably for the French people, not for the French, but the European and in the world as well. So I believe this will be a major factor for Emmanuel Macron in order to change the life. Emmanuel Macron is the president who wants to increase the rate of retirement to 60 to 65. And this is, of course, will impact people. People, are very tired now. We know that according to the many statistics and reports that people cannot work. Of course, with this kind of bill or proposal in the parliament, will of course protest, and the anger in the street will increase.
You've followed French politics closely for many years. What do you think are going to be the main issues that will confront Macron in his second term?
Well, I think the main struggle is about the retirement. As I said, I just mentioned the rate that he wants to change of the retirement. Of course, the employment has increased considerably in France. This is the main factors that can be a very, give a trouble for the Macron presidency if he doesn't take seriously. And the third point, which is very important, is the democratic crisis. People do not believe in the democracy in France, but in Europe. The other problems is with the border. France shared the border with the UK about the immigration. We've seen how the bad relation now with the UK government. So I believe Emmanuel Macron is in impasse with the other European countries. Is very unpopular, and we've seen the relation with Russia. I think will be beneficial for Macron because I think he's still in communication with Vladimir Putin in order to find a way, in diplomatic way, to stabilize the region. We will see, of course, as well the relationship with Iran. I hope that they will kind of good relation with other countries such as Iran, and we will see if Macron will resolve this unemployment. But if he will not resolve this unemployment in France, I believe the protests will take place in the street, and the anger will be more and more problematic.
Protests in the streets of France, what could possibly go wrong? Well, as they found out in the Bastille on the 14th of July. Some years ago, admittedly, quite a lot can go wrong. I'll be right back after the break. Stay tuned. watching كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television, coming from London, talking about France, which probably affects you as it affects me. Amina, obviously the French do protests like nobody else in Europe. At the drop of a hat, thousands can be on the streets, ships can be commandeered, bales of hay burning and blocking the highway and so on. But in a way, these protests, and I've been on a million of them, they don't really change anything. There we had our guest in Paris saying that Macron was really unpopular. But as I put it to him in my question, well, how come he won? Are these protests going to change anything in France, even though we might confidently expect them?
There are always protests, and French are known and famous for complaining a lot. But even when there are protests, nothing changed after. I participated with many protests before for Palestine, for stuff in France, but nothing changed for pension, for money. The government let them protest in the street, and yes, sometimes it goes wrong, but it doesn't change. It doesn't make any impact on the decisions or the future. Basically, what they decided to do, they will still go ahead.
It's true, Doctor, isn't it? That, for all, I was filled with admiration for the Yellow Vest movement, supported many, most, maybe all of their demands as I understand them, but they failed.
Well, I wouldn't say they failed. I think I can understand where you're coming from with that, and people can often think that we've had a huge protest and nothing's happened immediately after. But protests don't always work straight away. It's about generating a movement and sustaining it. And I think there's going to be events, incidents during Macron's presidency, which will really fire up the masses. And I think there's a strong likelihood that that protest movement, which hasn't resulted so far in any dramatic change, that it will reach a tipping point. And that tipping point could involve the sort of gendarmerie and the various classes of police in France beginning to have less confidence in the institutions that order them to do Macron's business. I think we already saw with the COVID protests, we saw the unease of some of the police officers who were basically sent in to beat people up. And these were relatively peaceful protesters. As you say, Amina, some of the protests in France can be very feisty, can't they? But the COVID protests were actually quite peaceful and people were being beaten up. And you could tell that some of the police officers really didn't like.
That's very interesting. France is France and England, of course. I had to laugh when he said they're going to raise the retirement age from 60 to 65. Ours has never been 60 and is now 68. So in a way, all the gains that the French made through trade union action and through legislation, the 35-hour week, the retirement at 60 and so on, they've all been lost to the neoliberal orthodoxy of Macron and people like him. Do you think a majority against Macron, however, in the National Assembly, which seems likely, overwhelmingly likely, just a month from now, not even a month from now, might that tip the balance and force Macron into different policies, different stances?
I think Macron will realise that he is up against it domestically, that there's too much opposition to what he wants to do. And I think he will increasingly focus on being an actor on the global stage. He is a globalist. He's a World Economic Forum young global leader, I believe, and he certainly seems to be spending more and more time now acting as a sort of global sophisticate, with his interventions on the Ukraine situation, for example, but also, as Joseph was saying, doing some of this globalist digital surveillance programming as well. So I think that's what he will focus on. He will turn away from petty issues in France, as he will see it, and be much more of a megalomaniac globalist.
And yet, Joseph, you think that his main challenges will be internal, as you put it. And I'm sure that you're right. Does that not, though, presuppose that he will be taking a line on international affairs that will be a bit more conciliatory than the Anglo-Saxons in Australia, Britain, and the United States?
Well, the beauty of modern liberalism is that you don't have to tell anybody what you're doing until you do it. So I think this is something we've seen from leaders like Obama previously through to Trudeau now, Macron. What they do is they switch sides with the wind until they get their way, and then they implement their policy. That's more or less what they always do. So Macron will always try and keep one side a little bit happier than the other until it's time to do whatever he wants to do, probably on the global stage. He's a globalist at heart. So I think when you're considering the battles he's facing internally, he's going to always try and facilitate, bringing out one little policy that makes him seem a little bit more right of centre or a little bit more left of centre until eventually no one quite knows what he's doing and he's already achieved his goal anyway. That's how these leaders operate.
He is a Tony Blair figure.
He's a Tony Blair figure. He's a Saul Alinsky in a sense in the way that he organises his structures. And I think there's something similar going on at the moment with the Tory party over here, whereby
they're all Blairites now, really.
A lot of them are Blairites, a lot of them are Lib Dems, and all of them are liberals, and with very few exceptions within the party, they're not real conservatives, So you've got a similar kind of idea here where people have infiltrated the status quo, the winning machine, the thing that gets elections done, and then used it to portray their own ideology. And I think that's what Macron's doing, more with a focus on the global stage, as you were saying, but trying to sort of divide and conquer internally first and then get the job done later.
He might just leave Mélenchon to run the domestic affairs.
Yes, well, I mean...
He doesn't need to get re-elected.
This is the thing as well, you've got to remember in France, the mayors are essentially still of communist ilk. That is the reality, that is the predominant local structure. It's still highly socialist, if not communist, in most of the local towns. So if Mélenchon can kind of consolidate that vote a little bit more, Bernie Sanders kind of style, then there is potential for him to get in. I still think that what will probably happen is Zemmour's supporters will all go over to Le Pen and might tip the balance that way, because he did have quite a large 7.5, 7.8 chunk of the vote, which is still to go somewhere, really. So you could see Le Pen.
So you don't think Le Pen is finished?
No. And I think even once she's done, her niece is probably going to come out of the woodwork from Zemmour's party.
Although there's bad blood between them. Let's hear from Dr. Alan Sabrowski in Pennsylvania, USA. He's a former director of studies of the U.S. Army War College and a Marine Corps veteran from Vietnam. He's an analyst and writer. Don't get to meet many men with that CV that often. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Doctor, would you describe this as a clean victory for President Macron?
I don't think it's been so much of a clean victory for him as it is a clean defeat for France. Marine Le Pen did considerably better than she has done in both of her previous attempts at the presidency. And it's not a function of a coalition of far-right groups as it's been presented. These days, almost anyone who isn't a communist is presented as far right. What it means is that France is going to continue, albeit more hesitantly, its continuing policy toward EU, its policy toward the Great Replacement, its policies of migration, its policies in support of NATO, and its anti-Russian policy. These, I think, are prescriptions for disaster. Had Le Pen won, the movement of France away from these policies, or even a slowing of them, a significant slowing of them, could have had a very salutary effect. What we've seen right now, as of today, is the first fallout from Macron's win. Finland has now announced that it will join NATO. Sweden is expected to follow within days. And that is going to double the border of NATO with Russia and put NATO forces directly along Russian border, far more than it has today. You might recall, although as a young man you may not, Mr. Galloway, that in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet Union placed its missiles 90 miles from the US coast, and we considered it a basis for risking war. We are going to, in this case, we being NATO, which is now an offensive alliance, not a defensive one, and driven by the United States and the neoconservatives and the liberal interventionists on the Democrat side, going to be putting missiles directly along Russia's entire western border. I doubt that Russia will be even as gracious as we were toward the Soviet Union in 1962.
What about the militarization of the EU, rapid reaction forces and so on? Do you see Generalissimo Macron pushing that line forward very robustly?
Absolutely, without any question. He is going to have to show to the people who supported Le Pen that he too, if you wish, has balls in a certain, although she probably has more than he does metaphorically. And he's going to have to pretend that he is strong. And what better way to do it than push this? I'm literally old enough to have grown up in the Cold War. I'm 80 years old. And so I grew up when NATO was young and the European Union was a dream, and it was the European Common Market. And I saw NATO develop throughout the Cold War. I saw the Common Market evolve into a European Union, which is, and both of them become something that none of their creators in the late 1940s and 1950s, or even in the 1960s, would have ever believed. They genuinely wanted NATO to be a defensive alliance. They genuinely saw the Common Market and the European Union to be something that would be a positive coalition that would be of benefit to its member states. The European Union has become intrusive and invasive, willing to destroy the cultures and civilizations of its domestic members. NATO has become an offensive alliance with this rapid reaction force, just the cutting edge of that. I see these both as being catastrophic, but Macron will push them. He has to. He has to, or show himself as even weaker than he is.
How will Macron play the Ukraine issue in his second term? Will he be more pro the United States or perhaps more hostile to the United States in the traditional French way?
That depends on how the war in Ukraine goes. Trying to second guess a politician looking at something that is not a clear-cut outcome is very uncertain. I have had several European friends, and I speak with a number of them in different countries fairly regularly, say that it's becoming increasingly clear that to many of the NATO member states, and including Macron's France, or I should say France under Macron, which is a very different thing, that their preferred outcome is a war between Ukraine and Russia that takes at least 10 years, that simply grinds down Russia, that occupies it, focuses it on that, and weakens it. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but I see no positive development in terms of the outcome of the war for Russia, the outcome of the war for Ukraine in terms of what is happening there, since the war is largely being fought on Ukrainian territory, and it is Ukraine that is suffering because of the war, in sense of the Ukrainian people being affected, the Ukrainian property being damaged by a perpetuation or prolongation of the war. Yet that is what seems to be wanted. That or a casus belli in which NATO, other NATO members will militarily become involved in the conflict. And if that does, Mr. Galloway, I suggest you cash in your insurance policies and live as well as you can for as brief a time as you can, because it will be a very brief time.
Amina, that's quite apocalyptic stuff. We don't really have time to go down all the byways of Dr. Allen's thesis. But let me ask you what you think this will mean for the Arab world, for the Muslim world. France is, of course, an old colonial power, an empire. It still acts like an empire, at least in Africa. Less so in the Middle East. They didn't join the invasion of Iraq, for example, thanks to President Chirac's fortitude. The United States is on the retreat there. Russia is quite a foreign thing for the Arabs. Do you think there might be some kind of role for the French under Macron in the Arab world?
I don't know. I don't know where they will go with Arab world, because they have trouble with their own Arabs. They don't know how to manage them. They want them to be what they call integrated, but in the same time, what they call integration, I think they mean more assimilation, because you can't be too visibly Arab or particularly Muslim. The problem is not really the Arab, we're more with the Muslim, because if you're Arab and you are not practicing your religion at all, you will have no too much trouble. That's more with Islam that they have a problem. And personally, I found very sad that the Arab countries that have a lot of power, a lot of money, whatever, they don't support their brothers in France. And some people of France are actually living for these countries, or UK or US, to be able to practice.
I sense a gap in the market. The United States is failing in the Arab world very substantially. Britain is not trusted. Russia is a long way away, not just in miles, but culturally, and so on. I just wondered if little Macron might see a niche for himself there. Dr. Nile, on foreign policy in general, Dr. Allen was quite apocalyptic, pessimistic. He thinks that Macron, to show that he has the necessary cojones, that he will become more hawkish towards Russia and so on. I'm not sure I agree with that. What's your take?
I'm not sure. It's difficult to see at the moment how the Russia-Ukraine thing is going to play out. But one thing that has become very clear is that Macron wants a larger Europe. He wants like a second division Euro League, which will include the awkward Brits. You know, we'll be brought back into the sort of Euro orbit.
The Euro Conference League.
Yeah. So maybe countries like Norway, but also
the East European countries.
Well, exactly, and I think that importantly, this could also include Turkey. Mm-hmm. So Macron being a globalist, and I think globalization, they started with Europe way back in the 1940s. If they could do this in Europe, they can do it anywhere. If they can bring together under one government the countries of Europe with their distinct heritage and language and history and culture, they can really do it anywhere. And I think that what Macron is likely to spend much of his second term doing is building that greater Europe with his sort of full Napoleonic hubris.
That must fill you with dread, Joseph.
Well, I mean, I wrote an op-ed at the very start of all of this where I basically suggested that we could be sleepwalking into World War III. So I'm probably not too far off Dr. Allen's comments there in my thinking. I think there's a few points to make there. Firstly, with reference to what you were saying, Amina, I think the unique problem with France is that it has no religious identity. It's very much a humanist society. That's the way it's been since the
They
French
worship
Revolution.
secularism.
They worship secularism.
As devoutly as anyone
Absolutely.
who's religious.
I mean, it's a religion in and of itself, the way the French do it. No one can compete with that. And the problem it presents is that there's no nuance when it comes to religious issues, cultural issues. I'm a Christian. I think when you compare Christianity and Islam, obviously there's vast differences in terms of what we believe, but in terms of empire building and history, there was the Christian world and there was the Islamic world. Now you have the humanist world, which is sort of sitting in the middle and trying to do something very different, which is totally eradicate religion on both sides of the aisle, you know. And it's interesting, obviously, from the Muslim perspective, you may not like Le Pen and what she says, but the reality is she's probably fighting for Christianity in a sense, you know. And it's actually all sides turning against Macron because he represents the modern ideologue, which doesn't believe in God, believes in liberal man. So I think there's a very interesting nuance there to be talked about in terms of the global perspective. And then I think the second thing as well is that Macron is going to find it hard to offer the European army perspective, the centralised European force, as an alternative to NATO. As we're seeing with Finland and Sweden joining NATO, it's almost like choosing your side, isn't it? We want NATO, we don't want the EU army, we prefer NATO, okay? So that presents another problem for Macron. How's he then going to suddenly consolidate everything under this one EU banner if European countries are joining the American-British alliance of NATO? And also referring to Dr. Allen's point, I think it's a terrible idea stacking up any kind of weaponry along the border of Russia because we wouldn't want them to do the same.
It was very chilling what he said, that it doubles NATO's border with Russia. And the comparison he made, unfortunately, I well remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. Calling me a young man was only an 80-year-old man could do that. But the apocalyptic bit was that if that happens, then there will be not just European war, but nuclear conflagration, which, of course, will make all of our discussions otiose. But I do think that Dr. Nail's point about a two-speed Europe, maybe a three-speed Europe, a Europe of concentric circles, consolidating the Franco-German power with, I agree with you, Macron in charge of little soldier Schultz, then a periphery of Eastern European countries who are, like Hungary and Poland, increasingly uncomfortable with EU diktat on cultural questions, migration questions, and so on. And then a third tier, which I hadn't thought of.
Or mentioning Turkey.
Including Britain and Turkey.
Turkey, yeah. And of course the Shanghai Cooperation Pact. Which...
Well, yeah, I mean, well, perhaps they'll be the enemy of the Shanghai Cooperation Pact, or perhaps we'll all end up in Macron's European net one way or the other. It's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you all for participating. We're not looking forward to President Macron's second term here. None of us, although some of us think it could have been worse. I've been George Galloway. This has been كلمة on Mayadeen television, and you have been a wonderful audience. Thanks for joining us.